I've tried many teas over the years, but there's always been one that's eluded me. The tea is called Seimei, and I was first introduced to it 4 years ago when I visited the field of Mr. Sakamoto. Mr. Sakamoto is a legendary Gyokuro farmer that produces flavorful green teas using only organic methods. He was growing a new type of tea plant called Seimei, but we would need to wait a few more years until the plant was ready to be harvested. Now, the time has come and we are ready to drink the Seimei Gyokuro.
Okay, so what I have here is a tea that I'm actually very excited about, and that is the Seimei Gyokuro. So this tea right here is a tea I was first introduced to when I visited Mr. Sakamoto in Kagoshima in 2019. And this is actually a very, very new cultivar. It might actually be one of the newest cultivars. It was officially registered in 2017, and it's made by crossing together the Fushun cultivar and the Saimidori cultivar. So when we were first introduced to this tea plant, I was visiting the fields of Mr. Sakamoto along with Oliver and Agnesa, and we were shown the first ever field of Seimei tea plants on the plot of land for Mr. Sakamoto. And this was a tiny little garden at the time. The plants were maybe a couple of inches tall, and we were told that, tea takes about 4 years before it's ready to be harvested. So in about 3 more years, the tea would be ready to drink and try out. And there was something kind of exciting about that, but also just a little bit disappointing because we got to see, this exciting kind of part of tea history, some of the first plants of this new cultivar being grown, and it seemed like so long in the future that I would have to wait in order to taste this tea. But here we are 3 years later, and Mr. Sakamoto actually sent us some tea as a gift from the Seimei cultivar. So this is the new cultivar, officially registered in 2017. But this is the first time I've personally been able to get my hands on some. So still very rare. This was designed, from what I can tell, to be a frost-resistant cultivar. So many of you might know that Japan is actually a very cold climate for tea cultivation when you compare it to southern China and parts of India, Sri Lanka, etc. So it's all about frost resistance. That's why Yabukita is so popular, because this is kind of a tougher, more frost-resistant cultivar, and it can be grown in central Japan. Not quite northern Japan, that's still too cold. But if you live in most of the east coast of the United States, I would say central Japan is a pretty similar climate. You get kind of cold winters, not a ton of snow, but the winters do go below freezing in the morning at least, and so you get frost that you have to deal with on the tea plants in central Japan. In southern Japan, in Kyushu, you don't have that problem quite as much. The winters are very mild. I was there in mid to late November, and it was about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Maybe I caught it on a good day, but not too cold. So one of the priorities for kind of the Japanese tea industry is to produce these cultivars that can withstand slightly colder climates than the tea plant is maybe used to. So they're doing these projects where they're crossbreeding different tea plants, going for taste, of course, trying to get a perfect taste profile. So for the case with the Gyokuro cultivar, that's kind of bred to be this strong, savory tea plant. Asatsuyu and Saimidori are kind of meant to be the sweeter ones, the lighter, sweeter ones. And these plants do very well in the south. But there's always this pressure to find a tea plant that can thrive in Honshu, the main island of Japan, because the winters do get a little bit cold. So Seimei could be the solution to that, and I'm really interested in testing this tea out. Just a little bit on Gyokuro before we get started, because I think a lot of people are maybe confused. This is kind of considered to be the most premium leaf tea in Japan. So this is known as the Emperor's tea because it was the tea of choice for the emperor. And it's made through a long labor-intensive production process. So the tea plant is actually shaded for 3 weeks before the harvest. And you can notice right here, the leaves are much darker than you might be used to. And this is because during the shading process, the tea is going to develop more theanine and more chlorophyll, and the leaves are actually going to get darker. But the reason they do this is because it actually makes the flavor sweeter, because when the tea leaf is exposed to sunlight, it produces catechins, kind of as a protection against the UV light. And this can actually produce a bitter flavor in the tea. There are some health benefits, a lot of health benefits with catechins, but they make the flavor bitter. So if you want to make a nice, smooth, and sweet tea, you're going to want to shade it for at least about a week. There are some senchas that are shaded for about a week just to kind of take that edge off. Of course, maybe you've heard of Kabuse sencha, which is 10 to 20 days, and then Gyokuro is 21 days or more. So these are the three basic types of shaded teas: shaded sencha, Kabuse sencha, and then Gyokuro is kind of the most sought after, most difficult to grow, at least. And Mr. Sakamoto really is specializing in this tea. And what's rare is that he's able to do it without the use of pesticides or chemicals. As we've talked about on this channel before, it's difficult to grow Japanese green tea without pesticides, but it's exceptionally hard to grow Gyokuro without pesticides or chemicals, because this long shading process is a really stressful time for the tea plant, and it kind of needs all the help it can get. So one of the special things we learned about when we met with Mr. Sakamoto is we learned about his philosophy towards organic farming, but also the particular methods that he used to make this really good, high quality organic fertilizer. So he's able to supply nutrients to the tea plants during the shading process without applying chemicals or artificial methods. And he's able to get a really strong flavor profile out of the teas. So let's go ahead and brew this up. Another thing I should share about Gyokuro that's going to come into play in just a few seconds is these long, tightly rolled needle-shaped leaves. This is something that makes it easy to pick out of Gyokuro. And it actually makes it so that it needs a longer brewing time. So most sencha teas, we recommend to brew it for just 1 minute. Gyokuro actually needs 2 minutes. So it needs an extra minute because the leaves are so tightly rolled that they need time to open up and release their flavor into the water. So 2 minutes is good. In terms of temperature, we go lower on the temperature. So 60 degrees Celsius, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason is because Gyokuro is meant to be a celebration of this kind of sweet umami flavor. And that's extracted at a lower temperature without extracting the bitterness. Okay, so if we take a look at the color here, you'll notice it's very opaque. At least that's what I notice. So it's not clear like you would see a lot of these other green teas. There's a cloudiness to it. It is much lighter in color than a Fukumushi sencha, for example, which would be kind of this emerald green color. Gyokuro does tend, even though the leaves are super green, it does tend to be a little bit yellower in terms of the brewing of the tea. Let's go ahead and have a taste. Right away, what's clear about this is the brothy texture. So it's very thick, and this is typical of a Gyokuro. It's going to be, very heavy, especially when you use this lower water brewing method that I used. I'm using a little bit less water than I normally do, and the same amount of leaves. So it's going to concentrate the brewing, and this is what you want with Gyokuro, because Gyokuro is not only meant to be a celebration of the flavor of the tea, this kind of sweet, savory flavor, it's also meant to be a celebration of the texture of the tea. So the texture is a very important part of a Gyokuro tea. It's very sweet. This kind of warm sweetness comes in very strong. This is something you get from Seimei, for example, this kind of warmer caramel sweetness. So I'm wondering, this is a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but I'm wondering if that taste characteristic comes from the fact that this is a crossbreeding of the Seimei and the Fushun, because compared to a Seimei tea, I'm also noticing a lot of similarities. So the Cha Meijin, for example, is our Seimei Gyokuro, also produced by Mr. Sakamoto, and this has a similar sweetness to it. It's very strong, it's very thick, and it's a little bit warm. It's kind of like this caramel sweetness, this like cooked down sweetness. But there is almost this kind of cereal flavor to the finish. So it's not entirely sweet. There is a little bit something going on at the back end. So the first thing you notice on the palate is this intense, thick, kind of brothy umami. Then it turns into a sweetness, and then towards the end kind of fades into a little bit of this cereal note. Yeah, it's amazing. When you are describing a gyokuro, you find that you're going more into the tasting notes of like a soup, for example. It's like very brothy. It's almost like meaty a little bit. There is some kind of this seaweedy, salty flavor happening. So these are descriptors that you would normally not use for a tea, but in the case of Gyokuro, it almost shares more similarities with like a soup, like a miso soup is what I usually use as an example, rather than like a black tea. It probably has more in common with a soup than like a black tea or a oolong tea or something like that. So I mentioned that for the first brewing, you need a full 2 minutes. Now the leaves are already open, they just need 20 seconds. So if you're brewing this tea 2 to 3 more times, you just need 20 seconds for each infusion. So I would say that's about 20 seconds. See, it gets much greener in the second brewing. It's almost luminescent. Very interesting. The second brewing, I was expecting to get more of this vegetal flavor, and it's actually not super intense. What I'm getting is actually almost this smoky kind of roasted flavor. It's almost like I said tofu earlier, so I'm thinking tofu, but it's almost like a roasted tofu, like a smoked tofu or something. We can also brew this a third time. Okay. Third brewing is much clearer, but it still has that kind of greenish hue to it. Yeah, in the third brewing, you're getting more into the minerality of the tea. So it's acidic. You kind of get that tingling sensation on the palate, but not a whole lot else. There's not kind of the mouthfeel or the strong tasting notes that you get in the first and the second. So you could brew this tea another time. Some people will actually take the leaves and put them in a smoothie or something like that. I can just compost these. That's what I tend to do. So thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this video and join me on this tasting that's been a long time coming. I've really been looking forward to this day where I get to finally taste the Seimei tea that I learned about 3 years ago when I visited the farm of Mr. Sakamoto. This is a tea that we may be selling in the future, but most likely not. I think we tend to look for different things in the tasting notes. The price of this one is much higher because it's such a rare tea. Be on the lookout because we may introduce like a special offer in the future, and if we do, it'll be a limited time. But overall, I would say I prefer the teas like the Chamei-jin, the Gyokuro Sasahime, and the Gyokuro Wakamusha. These are all tremendous Gyokuro teas produced by Mr. Sakamoto, and they're kind of using the more classic cultivars, I would say. So Saimidori is known for being super sweet, and that's the Chamei-jin. It's like this very light, sweet, almost has like a caramel sweetness, like I mentioned earlier. The Wakamusha, for me, is my personal favorite because I actually do like a little bit of this vegetal flavor in the Gyokuro, and this has it in spades. And then there's the Sasahime, which is a blend of Okumidori, Saimidori, and Yabukita together. So it's a really well-balanced tea. So these are kind of the more tried and true cultivars, if I can say that. And overall, I would recommend going for these Gyokuro teas if you really want to experience that that Gyokuro experience. If you're a Gyokuro connoisseur like me and you really want to try the rare cultivar, just stay tuned on our newsletter. We might introduce it in the future. But anyways, until then, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.